So the presentation that I'm going to give is a bit of a continuation of what I did this morning, right? So it's basically the path towards that, what we call that autonomous operation, right? So if you go to the next slide. So I introduced, for those who were not present, I introduced what TM Forum defines. So we basically have from level 1, basically a human operated network, to a level 5, which is a 100% machine operated network. Whether that's realistic, that's up to you. I think everyone has to decide for themselves where they want to be in that journey, right? But what I wanted to do in this presentation is basically, I took a step back and said, okay, let's say if we have a clean sheet of paper, how would we go about doing automation going forward, right? Because it's always hard. So we always have like a brownfield situation, but at the end of the day, we also sometimes have to take a step back. Are we still on the right track to get to that full autonomous operation, right? And so what I wanted to do in this presentation is two things. Share my perspective on how to go about that. So I had basically 4 currencies or 4 things that I thought are critical to get to that journey. And then I'm going to talk a little bit how we go about doing that, okay? So first of all, I'm going to talk about the 4 things. So next slide. So the first one that I think is very near and dear to my heart is what I talk about consumable aspect of it, right? And I think we touched upon it. I'm a practical person, right? So if I want to try automation, I want to test it myself, okay? What does that mean? I don't want to go to a cloud or something like that. I want to exercise it on my laptop, on my PC, and I want to actually see, does this work, right? That's what I'm talking about of consumption. The second aspect of this is that if we build it, and I talked about that before, is that we have to build it in a way that we can easily maintain and control the life cycle of it, right? Because I'm of the opinion that we have different ways to consume automation. Some people basically look at the vendor and they want to get everything from the vendor, right? So which is what I call do nothing yourself, towards a mode where people say do some yourself or do everything yourself, right? So I don't want to be in the business to control what you decide, right? But what is important is that no matter how you consume it, the life cycle of it should be small, right? So the effort to maintain should be limited, irrespective of how you consume it, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing, go to the next slide, is what I call predictability, right? So we talked about the trust in automation this morning, right? And when I talk about predictability, I talk about the following. So first of all, we had a lot of discussion about intent-based networking, right? So I think in the meantime, understand we have to define the what, right? And so we talk about that in a declarative way, right? So rather than saying how, we say what we want to achieve. Now, in that whole journey, what we don't really do is say, so we typically talk about the configuration, but we don't really talk about what I call the signals that we need to determine, does it work, right? Because ultimately, that's what it comes down to. It's not about, hey, this is what we want. We actually say, this is what we want, and we want to say, or we want to check, does it work, right? And both of these things are important to get to that predictability, because if you want to get to that autonomous operation, we want to basically go to a mode where you basically say, please, if I want to do this change, I want to say what the change is about, but also what is the information that is going to determine that it actually works, right? And if we do this right, we can actually build it in a way that we build it with a composable architecture, such that we actually build it in a scale-in, scale-out mode and get to that microservices framework that allows us to scale and use those components in a composable architecture, right? That's what I talk about predictability. The third currency, or the third thing that that we talked about is trustability, right? Is if we want to give the kings to the machine, we need to make sure we trust what it's doing, right? So how do we go about that, right? So first of all, it means that if we do a change, we need to get evidence, or we need to basically get a record of that change somewhere that we can actually look at it, right? And then what we want to do is test that change before we actually apply it to the network, right? So ideally going to like a digital twin type of operation. And then we actually get feedback where we can actually validate that change, right? Whether it's a software upgrade, whether it's a maintenance activity on a system, or whether it's a real change that applies configuration onto the device, I don't care, right? It should be managed in the same way, right? And so that's a system that we need in order to actually figure out that we can actually trust our automation and actually ensure that it actually works, right? The fourth is actually intelligence, right? So we talked about AI, and okay, we sprinkle AI in all of these things, but if we get the right signals out of the network, we can actually have the AI assist us and maybe eventually get more and more recommendations that we take into account in our decision making. So we actually can sprinkle intelligence around it and use machines or machine algorithms more to help us do the right decision to get to that autonomous operation. So these were basically the four things that I defined as requirements to build, let's say, our automation framework and automation journey, right? Now, the key question is, how do we go about doing that, right? And so what typically we do is, as every vendor, we build what we call a network management system, right? And it's actually very optimized for every vendor, right? But there's very few networks that actually build with a single vendor at the end of the day. So we started to explore, is there other ways of doing it, right? And a couple of years ago, I started to experiment myself with this approach. And then also came Nephio, right? So Nephio is who in this audience knows about Nephio or has heard about it? So very few people. So Nephio actually is an open source initiative that was started actually with a number of people. So Google was one of them, but we were also part of it because we were going into a similar direction. And we said, okay, can we not use a different way to do automation? So what we did in Nephio, it's an open source initiative in Linux Foundation at the moment. And it's actually leveraging Kubernetes as the automation platform that is vendor independent. And what is the use case that we try to focus upon, or we are focusing upon inside of Nephio, is actually 5G core, right? And I can tell you within a year, we were able to actually automate with these four currencies or four elements that I said, a full 5G core with both the radio as well as the core in a multi-vendor fashion. Okay? So if you go to the next slide. So why did we use, let's say, Kubernetes as a platform, right? First of all, it's open source, but it's actually very extensible, right? So that means, can we actually build the tooling inside of it to also consume networking gear, right? And what you see today is that I think most of you will probably know Kubernetes from container orchestration, but in the meantime, it's actually used for way more, right? And I put on the right-hand side some of it. Even AI, I would say that today most of AI systems that you consume are actually empowered through Kubernetes framework, right? Now, why am I talking about it? Is that, first of all, to get to that journey, because there's a lot of innovation. If you look to the community that sits behind, it's probably a factor 100 bigger than what we have here. And that also means that the amount of people, because we talked about skills this morning, the amount of people we can rely upon to help us in the automation journey is actually very big, right? So that means we are no longer building a snowflake, but we actually leverage things that are already been done. Now next slide. Now, so for those who are familiar with Kubernetes, basically there is a concept of a CNI. I'm not talking about the CNI, right? Because that's just to empower the container networking. I'm talking actually about using Kubernetes to extend it to be the automation platform for networking, right? And given that today that is not a direction we, the people in this room, have been going towards, we started to actually expand a bunch of capabilities in that system to give you that consumable, predictable, and trustable environment. So for those familiar with Container Lab, that is kind of a digital twin initiative that actually I started. We now have a Kubernetes way that actually allows you to spin up that lab through Kubernetes, so you actually can build your digital twin inside of a Kubernetes cluster using that framework. We also extended a Yang-based system, so to basically consume Yang-based systems from a Kubernetes-based system. And we are actually in Nephio, we built what we call an IPAM and DHCP, and we build basically a service catalog and orchestration to do all that change control and stuff like that. So with that, you actually have a bunch of tools that can actually be used as a basis for doing that automation and get towards that autonomous operation, right? Next slide, and that's my last one. So yeah, for me the key question is that why is networking different, right? So why should we not adopt Kubernetes as a platform going forward? Because are we so different? So with that, thank you.